Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. An investigation by Searchlight New Mexico and ProPublica found that New Mexico places foster teens with serious mental health conditions in shelters that don't offer the services they need. Joining us now to share more about this investigation is Ed Williams with Searchlight New Mexico. Ed, thank you so much for joining us to share more about your investigation.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Your story that published earlier this month started with an incident in Las Cruces. Can you describe that for us?
Sure. This was one of many incidents that happened at the My Friend's Place shelter, which is a shelter, one of 10 shelters in New Mexico, the only one in Las Cruces. In this particular incident, there were two foster kids, both of them teenage girls who had run away from the shelter and were caught by police at a gas station, at which point they got into an altercation with the police officers. One of the girls ended up in what's called a wrap restraint, which is, I mean, to me, it resembles kind of a straitjacket. Your legs are bound. There's a foam helmet on her head. Her hands were bound. It was a really traumatic thing for the girls, and especially for the one who was, placed in this restraint. These were kids, like all of the ones we're writing about for this series, who had, multiple diagnosed mental health conditions, serious problems that these shelters are not set up to handle. It's not as if they were running from the shelter because the shelter was a bad place. They were running from the shelter because they were being shuffled from one shelter to another, to another, to another. In one of the girls, we have documentation, basically spent her whole teenage years just moving from one of these shelters to another, where she's not, getting the mental health care that she needed. So after that night, when she was arrested by the police after running away, the officers took her to the emergency room, led her through the ER in handcuffs, got her checked out, and then she was released back to the same shelter again. And then very soon after, I think the next day, ran away yet again. This is one of 650 instances we found of kids running from these shelters in New Mexico over a 3-year period.
Can you describe for us what is a so-called high-risk kid and what sort of issues they may be dealing with?
These kids are, they're teenagers, usually 13 through 17 years old. In some cases, we'll find a 12-year-old here and there. But they're, for the most, there's always variation, but just to generalize, a lot of times these are kids who have been in the foster care system a good part of their lives. They have had one trauma after another, and they have, high levels of, psychiatric issues, things like PTSD, depression. A lot of them have suicidal behavior or sometimes even homicidal behavior, things that, the professionals who study this kind of thing say are really a result of their treatment in the system and a result of the trauma they've been through. And so they're kids that the state just doesn't have anywhere to put. They can't find foster homes for them. Most foster families are eager to take in, babies or, young children, but a teenager with serious problems, that's a hard sell for a lot of foster parents. The state doesn't have the resources it needs to help these kids, or if it does have the resources, it's not using them properly because the kids aren't getting the help. And so they're just, I think the term that I hear a lot from CYFD is hard to place. These are children or teenagers who just, they don't have a place for it. And I could get a little more into why that is. But, as a result of having nowhere to go, they're just living in, in these homeless shelters, moving from one shelter to another. And a lot of times in between these placements are living in the CYFD office building in Albuquerque, where sometimes they spend weeks or longer just, sitting in an office.
Wow. Now, I want to talk more about that, but I'd also like to kind of get a better understanding about what exactly happens when a shelter calls 911. Can you kind of explain the process to us?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of these situations, the shelters are required to call 911. If a kid runs away, I mean, that's the way that the system is set up, and it's kind of problematic. The police officer is the one that needs to enter a missing persons report. Enter this kid into the National Crime Information Center, the NCIC. File all the necessary paperwork to enter the kid is missing and try to go find the kid. That's just the way that the system works. What that results in a lot of times is, kids having altercations with the police, repeated interactions with the cops that can lead to a lot of problems. And so in a runaway situation, it's just, it's protocol. The shelters have to call the police because that's the way that the system's set up. If it's something like, an altercation between the kids, if a kid is acting depressed, the shelters call the police. They dial 911 as a last resort. It's not like they're itching to call law enforcement. But a lot of times these kids are, their behaviors are so extreme that the shelters can't handle it. I mean, sometimes these situations are really dangerous for the kids or for other kids that are in the shelters. So, we found over 1,100 calls to 911 over this period that started in 2019 and ended in mid 2022 that we analyzed. And it's basically every single day. There's a shelter somewhere that calls police to report a problem with a kid there. And in the vast majority of these cases, we're talking about foster kids. The shelters take kids who are not in foster care, but according to the managers of these facilities, sometimes 100% of the kids are foster kids. Sometimes it's lower, but the vast majority of the youth that are living here are CYFD kids.
So can you share with us a little bit more about why the resources don't exist? In your reporting, what were you able to find out?
Well, it really goes back to 2018. There was a facility in Albuquerque called Desert Hills. This was a residential treatment center, one of many throughout the state. And CYFD had kind of begun an enforcement push against these facilities. They had been the subject of a lot of allegations of abuse and neglect. There had been sexual assault cases, there were lawsuits, and there was a federal law called Families First that really pushed the states to turn away from this kind of what they call congregate care, basically locking kids up in these institutions to kind of wash their hands of these difficult cases. As part of that, so they closed this Desert Hills facility very early 2019, and that was 120 beds that the state lost, and they went on to close several more. Now the vast majority of these residential treatment centers are gone, and so that's where these kids would have gone previously. Like I said, there was problems with that, but that's how the system was. And so as part of an agreement called the Kevin S. suit that was filed a couple of years ago, the state promised to replace these facilities with a new network of, outpatient mental health services that these kids, well, all kids in New Mexico could access, and to place all these kids in foster homes. Because really, you can't, if a kid's in a shelter or some emergency setting, taking them to a mental health appointment is not going to work. They're just too unstable. It's too much of a traumatizing, home environment for lack of home environment. So they didn't build those new facilities. They didn't put all the kids in foster homes. They promised to stop putting them in shelters except for extreme, or I think it was extraordinary circumstances was the term. And they promised CYFD promised to stop having the kids in offices. But, they got rid of the old system. They didn't build a new one. So really, instead of solving a problem, they just kind of changed the nature of the problem to where now we have all these high risk, high needs teenagers that the state, the only place they can find that will take them are these youth crisis shelters, like, the one in Las Cruces we mentioned. There's also one in Santa Fe, 2 in Albuquerque. Throughout the state, we have, I think, 10 total.
So with that settlement in the lawsuit that you mentioned, how do you think the state is doing with keeping its promises?
I think the last assessment that was released, there were 49 targets that the state was supposed to meet. They met some, I think, 11 of them. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but that's my recollection. CYFD has not complied with the settlement, and it has made some progress here and there, but the progress has really been pretty stumbling. I mean, we should give CYFD credit where credit is due. I mean, they've tried. It's a very hard thing to build from scratch, but they did commit to certain certain deadlines, and they've just blown past almost all of them in terms of getting these kids in a stable place. So they have committed to these changes. I mean, that's a good start. The changes are, experts in the field say that the Kevin S. settlement is groundbreaking in a lot of ways. If CYFD does follow through with everything it's promised, it could make an enormous difference for kids, but it has not done very well so far. Just to clarify though, the monitors in this case that do these reports, they're looking in the past, so nobody really knows in the moment how things stand. They're analyzing like the previous year or the year before that, and very little progress has been made. But CYFD says it's doing a lot. The attorneys for the kids and the kids themselves disagree with that.
Your reporting also revealed that there seems to be some possible communication issues with CYFD and the shelters that they may be placing these kids with. Your reporting states things like details on mental health history not being revealed. Can you share a little bit more about this?
Yeah, we talked to employees of every shelter in the state that took kids during this time period that we analyzed from CYFD, and each one of them said that they have accepted referrals from the state for kids with problems like anything from like sexual misbehaviors to criminal histories that CYFD did not disclose to the shelters. And the shelters point out that it doesn't mean that they would say no if they knew this kid had these problems, but they need to be able to prepare and to take precautions in order to protect the other children that are there. So that is a common complaint at these shelters, is that they receive phone calls, referrals for these kids, and CYFD is asking them to take a kid, but they don't disclose the full history of that kid. We saw this over and over in police documentation as well. There's a case in the story with a kid who had stolen a car and was charged with battery on a police officer several days earlier, and then was taken to a Santa Fe shelter where he, smashed up the inside of the shelter, was threatening staff with a piece of wood, just got very violent. And staff there wasn't told that he had a juvenile probation officer, that, they didn't know about his recent history. So that's just one example. I mean, there's others where, kids have serious suicidal behaviors that are not disclosed to the shelters. All kinds of, histories that these kids could have that aren't always passed along.
So what's the response from law enforcement agencies? You're able to talk with some officers. Are they frustrated with incidents like this?
They're very frustrated. A lot of the police departments that we attempted to speak with, including the one, Las Cruces Police Department, declined an interview. But even still, in the body camera footage that we reviewed for this story, we can clearly see officers, for example, in Las Cruces, just speaking with each other about how incredibly frustrating it is for them to have to deal with these kinds of problems over and over and over. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office did speak with us and said that it was a huge frustration for them. They only have one shelter in their jurisdiction called Amistad, but every single deputy, according to the undersheriff in Bernalillo County, at that sheriff's department, which is the largest in New Mexico, has responded to calls at that shelter, hundreds of them. And it's a drain for law enforcement. In some cases, we found police officers waiting 5-6 hours for CYFD to show up, and it really bogs down police resources. And, in some cases, the officers say they can't respond to emergencies elsewhere because they're stuck dealing with the kid from CYFD who, in a situation that could have been prevented if things had been handled differently.
Do officers feel that they have the correct training to also deal with this issue?
Not at all. I mean, at least according to the ones that we've spoken with, there are officers that have crisis intervention training in some cases, but these are, young men and women, teenagers, who are in the midst of, mental breakdowns, psychiatric crises. in a lot of these cases. This is not something that police are supposed to be dealing with. And it's a problem that goes way beyond, foster youth at shelters. I mean, mental health and police is a longstanding issue. But specifically in this case, I mean, a lot of times these are officers that are called to deal with the same kid over and over again. We found multiple instances, including in Las Cruces, but also in Albuquerque and Santa Fe and elsewhere, where, the same officer would be called to deal with the same kid. And the cycle, in almost every occasion is that they'll take the kid in for a psychiatric evaluation at the hospital. Soon after, that kid will be released by the doctors because they're no longer considered an acute case. And then they're put back in the shelter because CYFD doesn't know what to do with them. And then, sometimes that very same day, sometimes a day or two later, officers show up again. And so obviously, if they were equipped to deal with this, we wouldn't be seeing this cycle happen over and over again.
What are child well-being advocates saying and voicing about their concerns with kids who may be getting caught up in this cycle?
I mean, advocates are really beside themselves. This is an issue that's tied up with a lot of others. I mean, the kids that we're talking about, like I mentioned before, are, they have been traumatized by the foster care system and the adults that hurt them before they were in the system, just over and over again. And it's just really distressing to their advocates, to their attorneys, that they cannot get out of this cycle, that the state cannot find a good home for them, that they can't put them somewhere where they can keep them safe. I mean, there was one story that was in the series where there was a 10-year-old foster child who was living in the CYFD office who was sexually assaulted by another foster child who was also living in the office. None of these kids should have been in the office according to the legal settlement. But not even in CYFD's own office building, the advocates say, can the department keep them safe? And so there's just enormous frustration on the part of attorneys and child welfare experts.
You were able to sit down with New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres to discuss this issue. He had some proposals on how to address this issue. Can you share a little bit about what the Attorney General proposed and where that stands right now?
Sure. Attorney General Torres had hoped to create a civil rights division within the AG's office that would focus explicitly on children's rights. I mean, there were some other things that the office could have done and planned to do that were outside the realm of children's rights, but the priority, according to the AG, would have been, enforcing the law against, departments like CYFD who were showing systemic failures that were violating the civil rights of children in its custody. So this would have been on the civil side, but, they could have forced settlement agreements. They could have compelled CYFD to share documentation, which is something that is a longstanding problem. The state doesn't share data or information about the kids in its care. And the hope from the Attorney General, and this was also supported by both chambers of the legislature, as well as Senator Heinrich was a proponent of this office. The hope was that this could have forced some sort of change within the department, which is in desperate need of reform. Even the governor has said that measure did pass both houses. And the governor vetoed it by not signing it. She didn't say why, but a lot of the political kind of analysts that I've been speaking with feel that a good part of it is probably because the department would have brought a lot of problems to light that wouldn't necessarily shine a favorable light on the governor's office or on her administration. I don't know whether that's true though, but regardless of the reason, that bill died, and so there is no Office of Civil Rights in New Mexico for children.
You've been covering issues within the CYFD department. Can you give us an understanding of just how much turnover has been taking place within that department, especially at the leadership level?
There's an enormous amount of turnover, I think, at every level in CYFD. There's some middle management positions that have stayed steady, and some say that's a problem too, because some of those positions, have been problematic. On the lower level, I mean, the case workers, the people on the ground, a lot of the workers at CYFD are honest, caring people who care about children and want, are willing to take a job that doesn't pay very well and that's extremely difficult because they want to make a difference. But it's, it grinds a lot of people up, and there's a lot of turnover in social workers and lower level, on the ground workers within the department. At the top, the rate of turnover has really been exceptional. I mean, since Governor Lujan Grisham took office, her first secretary, Brian Blaylock, resigned in 2021 after a story that we did showing that he had directed the department to use Signal, which is an encrypted secret messaging app, to do state business, and was, destroying children's records and public records in the process. Since then, Deputy Secretary Terry Locke stepped down shortly after Brian Blaylock. Beth Gilia, who was the Deputy Secretary after Terry Locke, stepped down. And now, last week, Barbara Vigil, who was the most recent Cabinet Secretary, also left. So we've lost two Cabinet Secretaries and two Deputy Secretaries in a pretty short amount of time. I mean, that turnover is problematic, right? Because how do you have consistent leadership? How do you execute something over a period of time when you can't hold on to the people at the top of the department?
The governor recently announced an overhaul at CYFD when it comes to operations. What are you hearing from folks about their response to this and how they feel it's going to make an impact?
It's one of those things I think we kind of need to wait and see what happens. There's a lot of studying and a lot of appointment of kind of committees to study that are involved. What strikes me is that, like, this is something that comes directly from the executive branch. I mean, an executive order, I'm sure, is welcome, but I would say that the governor seems hesitant to, let organizations, entities outside of, her department's control take the helm on these kinds of reforms, because there were bills also to create, an ombudsman for CYFD, other things that would have brought outside accountability, including the Attorney General's office. And the governor vetoed all those bills. I mean, some of them didn't make it through to a full vote in the legislature, but I do think there's a pattern of, of nixing efforts to change CYFD from the outside or bring outside accountability. I'm really not sure what this executive order is going to do. There have been similar things in the past, and we'll have to see. I think that there would be a lot more, potential for change if we had multiple attempts that went through the legislature, now working for change at CYFD, but that didn't happen.
Ed Williams is an investigative reporter for Searchlight New Mexico. Ed, thank you so much for joining us and sharing more about this important investigation.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
We now close the program by sharing news of a local organization that provides services to victims of sexual assault and child abuse. On this Community Connection, we revisit the nonprofit organization La Peñón in New Mexico.
La Peñón is the local rape crisis center in Doña Ana County and Children's Advocacy Center, and the mission is to provide comprehensive service to victims of sexual abuse and child abuse, and provide those services to individuals, families, and the community. We have the local rape crisis center, which sees any victim of sexual abuse that comes into our agency, and for that we provide counseling services, crisis intervention services, 24-hour hotline services, and we also have nursing staff that provide what is commonly known as the rape kit. We help advocate for individuals with law enforcement through the judicial system. We have our Children's Advocacy Center, which provides services to children that come in with allegations of child abuse, child sexual abuse, witnesses to domestic violence. We serve Doña Ana County and all of Doña Ana County, all the way to the Texas border. And then we serve Sierra County, so all the way through Tier C up to Socorro County, and we serve Luna and Hidalgo County all the way to the Arizona border. So Kid Talk is a warm line, and when I say warm line, it's because it's got limited hours, and now that we are in summer, it's 12. It turns on at noon and it turns off at midnight. We're hoping after midnight children are settled. During school hours, it doesn't turn on till 3 because school's in session. And it's just a service where we have volunteers that are specially trained to talk to children, either through voice or text. They can do either one. And it's just addressing whatever the child wants to talk about. It doesn't have to be specific to anything negative. The number to Kid Talk is 575-636-3636. We're not here to force anybody to make a police report. We're not here to encourage people to go through the judicial system or to work with any other agency. The only thing that we want to do is provide services and help to be able to move towards the recovery process. Our website features all of the services that we offer. The number to La Opinion is 575-526-3437, and that number is accessible 24 hours a day.
That's it for this week's show. Stay updated at krwg.org. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.